Welcome to Free to Speak, the New Zealand Free Speech Union podcast. If you enjoy the show, subscribe for uncensored conversations and free speech news from New Zealand and beyond. Welcome to another episode of Free to Speak. My name's Jelaine Heather and I'm the CEO of the Free Speech Union. Now, we're going to pick up here. We've talked a little bit on another podcast about the proposed nursing code of conduct that's out for review and is open for submissions at the moment. The two guests I've got today, we've got Deborah Cunliffe from the Nurses Collective of New Zealand and also Dr. Roderick Mulgan, who's not only a barrister, so that's a lawyer and a barrister, a doctor, but also on our Free Speech Union Council, our board. Welcome both to Free to Speak.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Now, we have, as I said, we've mentioned this before, we've brought up the proposed code of conduct, we've issued a media release, we're putting our own submission in for this. The submissions are open until the 9th of March. And essentially, it's about, it appears to be codifying the practice that we've seen happen over the last few years, or probably even going back more than a few years, in terms of nurses not being able to have private expression or their own personal beliefs and expression in their private life that sort of sits outside of their professional capacity. And in that way, the regulatory bodies, and this is without any patient complaints, the regulatory bodies are finding some of these expressions, and nowadays they're all online, right? That's where our communication happens. They're finding these expressions and then they're literally hauling nurses before them, often in confidential proceedings with their livelihood on the line in terms of, telling them that they're bringing the profession into disrepute, etc. Now, they've released this code. At first glance, it looks like it's got a lot of very vague and subjective terms in it. It really steps from the professional capacity of being a nurse into the private life and your private expression as a person. So you're literally almost on the clock 24/7. Now, Deborah, I know you've looked at this code probably until you're cross-eyed. Tell us a little bit about this, and then also about the practical impact that this has on nurses day to day and in their work life and in their personal life.
I think by way of background and just to set a little bit of context around this situation, nurses have historically conformed. It's taken a long time for us to ditch the doctor's handmaiden label, present members excluded, of course. In addition, nursing in itself as a workforce constitutes hierarchical structures, and it's also well documented to attract bullies. Now, all of that ensures what I would label as conformity and groupthink. It starts off at tertiary education and kind of meanders through into the workplace. The narrative is changing somewhat around nurse prescribers, nurse practitioners, and nurses who are critical thinkers in the clinical setting. But essentially, generally, nurses are not expected, nor are they prepared to stand up for themselves with regard to their own personal rights, freedoms, freedom of choice, freedom of speak, especially when it's outside of the prevailing narrative and, dare I say, the union protection. When nurses do speak out and when they do have an opinion, it looks bad for the nurse and the profession as a whole. Now, alongside that context is that nurses have historically been expected to be professional, to participate in systemic nursing knowledge, professional recertification, codes of conduct. So what are this current proposed revisions to the code are proposing aren't actually any different to what was proposed in 2012. And in fact, some of the language that's being used in this new proposed revisions, they've been around since the 1970s. So things like professional behaviour, being kind, being compassionate, they're not new to nursing. They've been around for a long time. But what has changed is, and I think where we're running into problems with this new code of conduct is that whilst the wording in the code of conduct remains the same, the words themselves and the interpretation of the codes of conduct and the competency frameworks have become weaponized, and their application is more to support what I would identify as the latest ideology or trendy liberal interpretations. So it's a little bit like nurses are the proverbial frog in the boiling water. They become accustomed to being told what they can do, can say, can't say. And so when terminology, as in Principle 4 in the new proposed revisions about making offensive, abusive, and using inflammatory orally informed statements, when those things pop up, nurses don't react. They stay very quiet and they just conform. And this is the problem we've got now in 2026 when revisions or proposed revisions to the code are attracting a lot of attention from people like yourself, Free Speech Union, and other sectors, but there's actually very, very little reaction from within nursing itself, including from the legacy unions, as to the potential pitfalls associated with this continuing conformity of
Mm,
being, doing, behaving. And
yeah.
and that is where we've got a problem now because nurses don't know what they don't know. And some of the potential things that could
Mm.
go wrong for nurses, they'll only realize they should have stood up and said something when it's too late.
And that's so often the case that we see as well. I really liked your analogy of in the boiling water, right? The surrounding water. Well, first it's about professional obligations, and everyone sort of knows that there's a line between personal and professional, and then it just becomes, as you say, that the water becomes warmer and warmer. The ability to express an opinion that differs from the conformity becomes less and less until the gap narrows so much. Roderick, I'd be interested. Deborah set such a great context in terms of the historical approach and sort of where nurses sort of came from. Given your very unusual background, both as a practicing GP, as a doctor, and a lawyer and a barrister, what's your reflection on that sort of direction of the regulatory codes and the profession?
I was very intrigued to hear Deborah setting that out. I haven't heard it quite put like that before, but it certainly does conform to the experience of nursing, particularly within institutions that, big hospital, that it sort of runs on procedures and processes and doing certain things in a certain way. And it's not an environment that encourages individual thought in any great way. Certainly not unless you get to the very top of the tree. So I think it's true that this is an environment where conformity, going along with the crowd, doing what you need to do, this is a great big ship moving forward and we've all got our little bit, that does lean to that sort of atmosphere. And nurses are less likely to be stroppy than maybe in other professions. I've also noticed that if nurses are split out of that environment somewhere else, and given more responsibility, then the individual thinking tends to follow it. So it's not so much nurses as people, but it's the environment that they're in. So small private hospitals, community practices, you're more likely to get nurses who express opinions, disagree with you, tell you when they think you're wrong, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, most of the nursing profession is, of course, within the institutional model. So that was my observation years ago, that it's not so much the personalities attracted to nursing, but the environments that they're placed in. And when those environments are more individualistic, then the individual tends to come
Mm.
forward.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And then I think it is important to pick up on another point, Deborah, that you mentioned that a lot of this language has been around, for a while, and it's not that new. But what is different is the fact that they are being picked up and really are being weaponized to narrow down that ability to have a different opinion or to express it outside of work, which I would argue, and we are going to argue, I believe, in the Kath Simpson case, was completely contrary to how the code was first written, right, and what it was intended in. And I think something that speaks to that specifically is the fact that these proceedings that we're encountering, they aren't of patient complaints.
Mhm.
They aren't
No.
community led in terms of the professional standard of behavior or the level of professional care that someone's giving. It's the regulatory board or sort of other people in the wider community who are saying, I don't think you can say that. That's not good. And is that what you're sort of seeing, Deborah? And you mentioned about the weaponization of the code. It's just been narrowed down, and they're stamping out any individual disagreement or private expression.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the result of that is that because nurses see what happens to another person, they are frightened to speak out. So they just told a line and, are fearful of voicing an opinion. And nurses historically have practiced defensively. It's a well-known terminology in nursing, that we be careful in our clinical practice not to do something wrong. So we're almost on red alert all the time. And that is now spilling over into these issues such as democracy and freedom of speech, because now nurses are very aware that anything can and will be used against you in a court of law kind of scenario. But the bottom line is, like anybody else, nurses should be able to speak freely, share opinions and worldviews, and not be frightened to discuss things like critical race theory, culture, gender politics, whatever it looks like, especially in their personal lives, but also in their professional lives. Now, I suppose where I might just, slightly differ to the fundamental approach that Free Speech Union takes, and that's absolutely correct, is that because nurses have always been expected to represent a professional cohort of carers, and to that professionalism enhances the trust and respect that patients have in the nursing profession. I do think that, anything that nurses say needs to be lawful, not egregious, and not impact delivery of nursing care. So, I do add some provisos around what we say, but I believe that every nurse has got the right to say whatever it is she needs to say, and there should be no limits on that. But, one of my life's lessons has been people will very often not remember what you've said, but how you say something. So I think one of the things about nurses is often we carry so many emotions. We're dealing with life and death issues, and, often we blurt things out without thinking the context and the impact it may have on people. And I think that's one of the things that, I would encourage nurses to do, is to think about how you say something. Still say it, absolutely. We will defend your right to say what it is you feel you need to say, but how you say it may need to be considered.
I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road, right? In terms of Roderick, I'd love your opinion on this. Where we have a professional, bringing the profession into disrepute or a professional competency standard. You know, it's easy when you can draw the lines, and as it is with Cath Simpson, I think the vast majority of her tweets were about immigration or other matters or things that are happening, just in the wider context, nothing to do with her job at all. But there is obviously a line there of professional competency and holding yourself out to a certain standard. Where do you draw that, Roderick? How do you sort of define where that is? And this is always the trickiest bit.
Yeah, well, that's the whole nub of the issue, isn't it? It is true, and the Free Speech Union has never disputed that when you join a profession, that does impose upon you an obligation to conduct yourself in a certain way, including in your private life. So it's not just when you are practicing. So the profession can legitimately intervene if you have a criminal conviction, if you become bankrupt, if you have a substance abuse disorder, that sort of thing. That's traditionally what this concept of bringing the profession into disrepute, which has been the law for a very, very long time and is a foundation principle of all professions. You've got to be an upstanding citizen to practice a profession. That's what it used to mean. And that is still what the statute actually says. That's the legal standard to which both sides, both the accusers and the individual nurse, have to address if an issue is made of your private conduct. Was it enough to bring the profession into disrepute? Now, you're not required to be a model citizen. You can have a shouting match with your neighbor over the back fence. You can have a disruptive dog. You can play a loud stereo. The sort of thing that goes on in everyday life. You do not have to be perfect. The bringing the profession into disrepute is a reasonably high bar. It's not the criminal bar. It's not like beyond reasonable doubt, but it's bringing people into disrepute means in a reasonably substantial way, the sort of thing that would make you think the less of a person's character. That's what it's meant to be. And what's happening is that this concept is being gradually weakened so that simply an opinion that is outside the group of opinions that the people running the nursing council like and approve of are now being turned into accusations that you have brought the profession into disrepute,
That's right.
or
So this
even
is a
expressing yourself crudely and rudely. Kath Simpson, for instance, was on Twitter. Now, anybody familiar with Twitter will know it's a reasonably barrel scraping forum for the crudest, rudest thoughts. It's got some very erudite stuff as well, but it is an absolute marketplace of ideas. And anybody going on Twitter should be under no illusions about the sort of thing they're going to read. And the sort of thing that she's put out there includes things that are blunt, that are silly, and that are controversial, none of which ought to attract professional discipline, particularly where she doesn't even say she's a nurse.
Yeah, understood. And that is, and I think you've both raised, that is where the bar has got lower and lower, and the it feels like the level of conformed ideas or approaches has got narrower and narrower in terms of what they can expect. Um, Roderick, could you speak a little bit more just sort of to the case, and I suppose we talk a lot about the process as the punishment here, in terms of, and Deborah's mentioned sort of the self-censorship that happens. You see someone getting into trouble, you see someone's livelihood on the line, and etc. And you just self-censor, right? You exclude
Yes.
yourself from the conversation. And it is an election year, and I think this does make a difference in being able to express robust opinions, especially outside of your profession, publicly. Um, Talk to us a little bit about the process as the punishment with Kath.
Yeah, just going back slightly to what you said about the bar getting lower and lower, I think one of the points that's relevant to make here is that the bar is still traveling, and it is still possible to envisage getting some judgments of authority that might restore the bar to a higher point. So we're still wrestling over where the bar should be. Certainly, there is pressure on it from the Nursing Council, but the Nursing Council don't ultimately decide because we do have due process, we do have the ability to have decisions reviewed and that sort of thing. So just to fill people in, if you are a member of a profession regulated under the Health Practitioners the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act, that act provides for various councils to regulate different branches of the health profession, and there are 15 such councils. So there's medical council, nursing council, physiotherapists, pharmacists, that sort of thing. If you do something they don't like, they can convene their own committee and discipline you. If they decide it's a bit more serious than that, they can refer it upstairs to a thing called the Health Practitioners Disciplinary Tribunal. And that's one tribunal that governs all 15 of the councils. And if your regulatory council decides to do that, then they become the prosecuting body, and you have to defend yourself in front of this tribunal. And that's where Kath Simpson is up to. But the tribunal is, of course, not the last word. We have the ability to go to the regular legal system and ask for decisions to be reviewed. And that did happen last year with a case called Turner. And Turner was a bit of a mixed bag. It did find that some of the comments involved in that case were legitimate subjects for discipline, but then that nurse expressed herself in rather stronger terms than this nurse. But it did also say at the same time that even if you are a nurse, even if you're a member of a regulated profession, you can express yourself in robust terms on contentious topics like immigration. So to that extent, it was quite a good judgment for us. And that is now binding on the Health Practitioners Disciplinary Tribunal. So I'm very intrigued to see exactly how they're going to handle Kath Simpson. So What she has posted now, first of all, bear in mind she didn't say she was a nurse. It is possible to work out that she's a nurse if you do some research. If you Google her name in other contexts, if you pick up on clues like one text, she refers to reading patient notes, for instance. So if you spend some real time analyzing her online presence, you could work it out, but she doesn't say so. So she posted things like, um, she referred to the known conspiracy that Michelle Obama is a man. I had not personally heard of that one, but apparently that's something out there. She made anti migrant sentiment comments, particularly referring to Middle Eastern people. She used the C word to refer to other women. Now, I recall there was some controversy a few months ago with a prominent journalist using the C word to refer to the Minister of Finance when the Minister of Finance reformed the pay parity laws. Now, so truly that is an objectionable word, but it is a known word. We've all heard it from time to time, including in the media. Does that bring the profession into disrepute? She referred to beneficiaries as drug dealers. Well, she didn't actually say that all beneficiaries are drug dealers, but she said that some drug dealers are beneficiaries, and I would not be remotely surprised if that was true. She posted misinformation about abortion law changes, claiming it allows children to be killed after they've been born. Now, that's just a flat out untruth. She did not say that. What the tweet says is that recent changes to abortion laws mean that a pregnancy can be terminated at a stage that the baby would have lived if it had been born. And that's a very different point. And that is also true. She described Pride Week as a hypersexualized perversion that should be banned. I mean, you even hear gay people come out and say that Pride Week is not a valid depiction of homosexuality, that we've spent decades fighting to be recognized as part of mainstream society, and this sort of thing really doesn't help. And you posted a description of transvestites trying to have access to women's spaces, which is a well-known topic of controversy, as people who slap lipstick and a wig on a pig. That's the tone of what we're talking about. That's what she's going up to the health practitioner's disciplinary tribunal for, all in her spare time.
Right.
Does that bring the nursing profession into disrepute?
And I think it's important to understand that we all may disagree with this. We may find some of these views offensive. We may find them that they're not views that reflect what we think, but also that's not the point. You know, Cath
That
Simpson.
is absolutely not the point. I am not
Mm.
going to be sitting there saying, members of the tribunal, these are reasonable opinions. I don't think anybody believes Michelle Obama is a man. I don't care. It's not the point. She has a private life. She can say that if she wants to. We can all say what we like in our private lives with certain restrictions. If it was overtly racist, it might well reach the bar for bringing the profession into disrepute. If it was clearly mad and had dangerous implications, it might do that. She also referred to the COVID vaccine as being inadequately tested. Well, there is room for that opinion. The COVID vaccine was brought to market much sooner than the vaccine normally would be because of the urgency of the pandemic. Well, it's relevant to discuss that cost-benefit trade-off.
And so we're really looking for that line between, what is legitimately bringing the profession into disrepute versus what are just lawful opinions that you might not like.
Well,
That's
But what
exactly right. Can I just jump in there? I mean, just back to the code and the context that the code does not mean that nurses should not have moral views. It doesn't say that they should not have political opinions. It doesn't mean that we have to agree with every decision of government or remain silent in public debates. And that's what Cass done. She's made her opinion. She spoke her mind. But another thing that is woven through the code in various principles is this ability for people, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the the patient or health consumer, as the Health Practitioner Competency Act refers to. I prefer the word patient. It doesn't have to be the patient making the complaint or even their partner or family. It can be a member of the public or a colleague. Now, we know in the world we live in that everybody's complaining about everybody else, and there's this real possibility of mischievous reporting where a nurse can say something, but just because an employer or a colleague doesn't like that particular nurse, they can pick up on even the slightest moral objection, and they can raise that to a disciplinary event with either nursing council or a health practitioner disciplinary tribunal. So, throughout the code, there's these vague recommendations that anybody can make a complaint about a nurse. And I'm not quite sure who made the complaints about Kath and under what circumstances, but we, by being the frog in the boiling water, have put ourselves in a situation now where absolutely everybody and anybody can comment on a nurse's behaviour, both in professional and personal. And we're going to see more Cath Simpsons because, more people are now aware you're a nurse, I can report you. And that actually is not, I'm sure, the intent of the code, but that is how it could be misinterpreted.
Well, and also
With
when
the
you
proviso that if we were to get some success
Yes.
at a higher court level, and that's a long way off, and it's a
Yeah.
long, expensive way off, but if we were successful there, we might have some chilling effect on these
Set a precedent.
complaints. But you're quite right in the current environment. If I could just throw in another example that quite shocked me when it happened a couple of years ago at the Free Speech Union, was approached by a nurse who posted online a very thoughtful and reasonable opinion that endorsed the pro-life anti-abortion worldview. And it wasn't expressed with any strong language, and it was in a context where people were discussing such a thing. Now, for that and nothing else, a member of the public who had strong pro-choice sympathies later complained with the nursing council, and that's fine. You can make silly complaints if you want to. The issue is, what did the nursing council do? If the nursing council had any understanding of appropriate boundaries, they would simply have said, well, that's obviously not something for us. They, in fact, wrote to the nurse and said that they were going to open an investigation. And they got a letter back from our lawyer saying they certainly weren't going to do that, and that was the end of it. But the fact they would even try it on, the fact they even thought it was worth a go, is deeply concerning.
This is more common than you imagine. And it only takes one nurse in one hospital to get that letter, and then every nurse in that hospital will refrain from whatever behaviour led to that. Just the fact that you get that letter through the post with nursing council on it, it makes your heart beat faster. It, puts you off your food for a few days. Nurses don't like being told off. They don't like having things being picked up and, having their behaviour brought to the attention of the nursing council. So, the impact will be that more nurses will just be silenced and just not speak out and not voice an opinion. And I would just back to what you mentioned about Kath and Turner mentioning some anti-immigration issues. Absolutely, every nurse has got the right to have a view on immigration, ethnicity, a number of topics. I suppose one of the things that I am very much aware of is that whilst you might make a general statement about immigration, tomorrow you might be nursing somebody from that particular cohort of immigrants or refugees or whatever. And if they know what your thoughts are, how can you be that trustworthy, reliable, respectful relationship? So this is another dilemma within, what is right, what is wrong, and with making these blanket statements. And that's back to what I said earlier about nurses making the statements, but removing it from the clinical context. So it's having an opinion, but not one that directly can impact or be manipulated to have seemingly impacted the clinical context. And that nurses aren't trained to do that because they're trained from very early on, think between this remit and this remit. They're not told how to manage these kinds of situations. And maybe this is what we need to do.
Mm.
Maybe we need to equip nurses better to deal with mischievous reports or potential legal challenges or whatever, context they come in, and to be aware of what that looks like and how to say what they want to say, but say it in a way that keeps them safe. We never thought, when we started nursing that we would be having to defend our words, our thoughts, our freedom of conscience, freedom of speech. But here we are, and nurse training has not evolved to cover these issues. It's made us defensive, as I alluded to earlier, rather than standing in our truth and in our authoritarian stance, because nurses do have authority. We can speak, we are worth listening to. But unfortunately, now when we are listened to, we end up getting into trouble for doing that, for speaking out. So we've got a bit of work to do in this space, and hopefully, organisations like the Free Speech Union, will be able to provide guidance along some of these issues.
Can I just jump in there? Because I think what you've touched on is a vital point, because this is, of course, the whole justification for going after people's opinions, that you will be faced with nursing a person who is part of that opinion that you expressed. So that is the justification for squashing it. This is a vital thing to meet head on. And the answer is, of course, that as part of your professional life, and indeed in most professions, you have to deal with all sorts of people as you find them, people that you like, people that you don't like, people that you approve of, people that you don't approve of, people's opinions that you might agree with, people, the whole lot. You just deal with what comes in the front door. And it's just part of your professional standing that you don't allow those opinions to intrude into the clinical context. That's just part of how the world works. And if you did allow those opinions to intrude, then that is a legitimate point for discipline to arise. So it's a little bit like saying, if you go to the pub and you drink too much, we should prosecute you for drink driving because you might get into your car. Now, at the moment, you do actually have to get into your car before you get prosecuted, and that's the way it should be. So if you have opinions about Islam, about trans people, about gay people, about Maori rights, you shouldn't be disciplined for those opinions until the point that it can be shown that they influence your clinical practice. The fact that they might influence your clinical practice isn't enough, particularly given that it's just part of everyday life to deal with people that you don't like, approve of, that sort of thing.
It really does translate into a bit of thought policing at that
Yes,
point,
exactly.
right?
That's what
That
those
sort
yeah.
of predictive future thought policing, and which I imagine, sort of, Deborah, what are the consequences for nurses on the ground? They self-censor, they withdraw. I'm particularly concerned about sort of the public gag order that's sort of in here, which seems to preclude nurses from going public with some of their healthcare concerns, even if they have exhausted the sort of internal whistleblower channels. And that surely can't be healthy for a profession where that involves the public, that it's so important. What are your views on that?
Yeah, it's interesting that in this proposed revisions to the code, they have mentioned the Whistleblower Act, but it's just a very brief statement. They haven't built any framework around that, and it's up to the nurse. And again, nurses are not trained to look at the Whistleblower Act, and it's not part of nurse training. I mean, it may come into postgraduate study, but certainly as your basic nurse training, it's not there. So the nursing council's left it with nurses to consider what the application might be for them. But nurses are just too busy. The majority probably won't have even read the proposed revisions. They're certainly not going to be considering what a whistleblower act would look like and under what circumstances it might be appropriate to use it. So if a nurse found something wrong in the clinical setting, they'd probably go to a manager, um, and then the manager, if they felt it was, and this is probably one of the weaknesses that I perceive under the Whistleblower Act, if the manager perceives that there's an issue, they'll escalate it up the food chain essentially. But nurses, and there's currently a whistleblower in court at the moment who managed the Whistleblower Act so far, but then decided that it wasn't working in his favour, I believe, and went outside of the provisions of the Act and made some journeys to other people and revealed some information that fell outside the lawful protection of the Whistleblower Act. So nurses don't know what is right and what is wrong and what will be protected and what won't be protected. So it's just going to be back to this silencing and nurses not feeling that they can speak out. So the end result of that is, first of all, we've got nurses that have an opinion that can't lawfully speak out, but the the reason all New Zealanders should be concerned is because public health could potentially be impacted if nurses who see what is happening on a day-to-day basis in the clinical setting, if they stop speaking out, stop indicating poor practice, incompetence, unlawful actions, if they don't feel they can because they don't understand what frameworks are in place to protect them or how to use them or how to apply them, the public will be the ones to suffer. So, and you're quite right before you mentioned it's a political year. And this is actually really, a lot of what I'm seeing in this code are assumed ideologies that have been hoisted on nursing for very many years, but now they've taken on a life of their own. A lot of this is left-leaning liberalism that i- i- it's got a different interpretation to what it had even 10 years ago. And nurses haven't caught up. We just believe everything is the same, the kindness, the compassion, the same as they were in the 1980s, 1990s, but actually everything's got a new application, and these are imposed by nursing council, regulators, unions, managers, and nursing really needs to stop and to consider what this means for each individual nurse on a personal level and what it means for their patients in the longer term.
Yeah. No, no, I think that's right. And the pattern that we're identifying here, unfortunately, we're seeing happen across many different regulations, not just in healthcare, but across a lot of regulated professions in terms of narrowing down how people can speak out, narrowing down what they can speak out on, and sort of having those, Roderick, I think that was such a great point that you can be professionally absolutely competent, serve your patients well, serve the community well, do your job, and still have an awful opinions, or you know what I mean, and be yourself in your private life, and we are able to walk and chew gum at the same time, sort of, I guess. And so just in wrapping this up, in terms of submissions to the code, and then in terms of sort of Cath Simpson, I'll start with you, Deborah. What should people do? How do we affect change here? What's the best next steps in terms of the proposed code?
So I think if people feel strongly about this, just as a nurse can be reported on the say so of a member of the public or a final member, if the public feel concerned about the code of conduct for nurses, they can make a submission, a personal submission. I think submissions close on the 9th of March. I think from our perspective, so the Nurses Collective have made a 24-page submission to the Nursing Council on this, and we're asking for clarity and a distinguishing between the professional and personal conduct of nurses. And we also really believe that only matters directly related to health and safety and the Nursing Council's legal scope should fall within its jurisdiction. Because what we're seeing, and I think what this conversation has pointed out, that a lot of these regulatory bodies are broaching into areas that are actually not part of their jurisdiction. So, nurses should not be subject to disciplinary action for lawful activity or expressions of opinion, certainly, outside of the professional setting and inside the professional setting when they don't bring the profession into disrepute through unlawful or egregious behaviour. I think we also need to think about how we can protect the rights of nurses to freedom of expression. And that isn't just going to be through this submission. We need the government to get on board, as with all of the other regulated professions, and start giving us clear examples and clear definitions of what this code is meant to say or should say in 2026. And this needs to go back to the nurses for clear consultation, not a consultation that I can guarantee will attract probably less than 10% of nursing, and probably some submissions from left-leaning liberal organisations. So we need to protect that freedom of expression and advocacy, but it's got to, I believe, got to come from higher up. I don't believe Nursing Council have got the power to do much at this stage. I think it needs to come from government. And I also think that, there are some good things in the code, and I think it's important to point that out. So like principles of informed consent and ethical practice, and including the far now in care plans and caring, at the bedside with the patient. They really need embedding in any code of conduct and ethical practice. They have been overridden over the last few years. So even we need to ensure nurses' rights and professional responsibilities are respected and protected, even in times of pressure or times of crisis. And that hasn't happened. So again, we're grateful that the Nursing Council have raised that issue in this particular revised submissions. And also, I really believe that this no code of conduct should occur in a silo. It should be part of the documentation, which they have clearly done, but also it's an ongoing, ever changing and morphing documentation. So it's been 2012 was the last code of conduct. Really, we need to be having these conversations a lot more regularly because the world is changing so quickly. So that would be another recommendation from us, that we just engage in ongoing consultation around the issues that are coming up. I mean, currently at the moment, there's been a lot of media attention around transgender rights, but in some parts of the world, they've reached the peak of that conversation and things are changing with regards to those rights. And we saw the recent issues in Darlington in Scotland or the UK, I forget which one it is. But what was built up and became an ideology has now started to change a little bit. So there's no point leaving something for 10 years before it's addressed again. We need to be current in that moment. So really, I suppose we know that the revised code maintains high professional standards and we're happy about that, but we explicitly need Nursing Council to safeguard nurses' rights to what we define as self-representation and freedom of expression in their personal lives.
No, and I think that's really well said. You can go to also our campaign, sort of fsu.nz. You can sort of support the nurses. We've got a bit of a gimmick there. You can sort of put some phrases in and sort of check to see whether it's code compliant. Spoiler alert, most things aren't. But we can also sort of guide you a little bit through how to submit, how to send your thoughts in, how to have do a submission for the code, because it is important to submit. It is important to have a say. And as you say, recognize there are some great things in here, but there are some real stretches that that the code has made. And as a free speech union, we are considering, as you say, going back to the primary legislation or to government to sort of say, look, this is an area that needs to be cleaned up. With the regulators, there's teachers, there's veterinarians, there's nurses, there's sort of architects, etc. There's lots of these regulatory boards that are moving into it feels like a lot more conformity of either thought or ideology or belief that feels like it's right outside the professional competence and to do the job. And Roderick, with Cath Simpson, what sort of the next steps? We're holding out hope. We're obviously going into bat for her. Sort of what are the next steps with Cath? How can people get involved? Sort of in this, or what should people do if they find themselves in this situation?
Well, Kath Simpson has received the formal step that charges her with bringing the profession into disrepute, and there will be a hearing in front of the Health Practitioners Disciplinary Tribunal later in the year. There's no scope for the public to get directly involved in that, but it must be emphasised that what's going on is that the Free Speech Union is bringing its resources to bear. And myself and Douglas Brown are barristers on the board of the Free Speech Union. We're giving our time for free. Hannah Clow is a lawyer that the Free Speech Union employs. All of this is being driven by donations. So please, we only survive if we have your support and your money. So if you believe in what we're saying, a donation, every little helps, but of course, a lot helps even more. Please bear in mind that that is the only thing that keeps us going.
Yeah. Well said, Roderick. And one of the things that we hear from people all the time is that they get isolated, right? They think they're the only person going through this when they receive that letter. Deb, you talked about, your heart racing, the stress goes up. And often these are sent with, you can't tell anyone. They're often sort of cloaked in the sort of confidentiality and sort of secrecy. So again, it's about reaching out. It's about either reaching out to us or to your community, communicating with other nurses about your situation. You might find that you really aren't alone, and more people than you think have sort of suffered this. And I think that's also not to be overlooked in terms of if you face this in isolation, nothing's going to change. But together, putting the submissions in, talking about it, defending Cath Simpson, perhaps we can affect some change in this. Guys, thank you so much for your time. Deborah Cunliffe from the Nurses Collective, Dr. Roderick Mulgan on our board as well. Thanks for talking about the Nurses Code of Conduct, and Kath Simpson.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Free to Speak. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and consider sharing the podcast with others. We release new episodes regularly, and subscribing is the easiest way to stay up to date. If you have any questions, feedback or suggestions, you can contact us at podcast@fsu.nz. If you want to find out more about the New Zealand Free Speech Union, visit fsu.nz.